French maps until 1763 was part of Quebec, of Canada and Quebec. All the way down, well, the French claimed all the way to the Hudson River. They didn't occupy it. Actually, it was the Iroquois that occupied the Adirondack, if anyone did. And there were French settlements, however, at Ogdensburg, Fort La Présentation, from 1748, and Akwesasne, the St. Regis Reserve, which actually was begun by a party from Kanawaka, another Mohawk reserve, Iroquois reserve on the St. Lawrence near Montreal. After the American Revolution, several thousand American loyalists moved to western Quebec, and to accommodate them, the British divided Quebec in 1792 into Upper Canada up the river, which became Ontario, and Lower Canada, which would later be called Quebec. Lower meaning lower on the St. Lawrence, it was still under French law, land law, and the seigneurial system, which is a landlord-tenant system, very much like the Dutch and English one down on the Hudson River. Those are the two examples in North America of that landlord-tenancy system. Under that law, the tenants, or habitants as they were called, and nearly all French-Canadian farmers were tenants, could pass on durable leases to their sons. Rather than primogeniture, the custom was to divide the land among the sons. So if you had a lot of sons, that meant for some small farms. And some of these farms, which were strips running down to the river, got so small that it was said that one tree shaded 3 of them. And the provincial government had to do something about it, so they had to step in and put a limit on the size, how small a farm could get. As the population increased, there weren't enough farms for young men, enough land, and so, and many desired to escape farm life anyway, they began to go to Montreal and Quebec City, where the early industries were mills, shipyards, or off to the woods for lumbering, both at the time for English bosses. And of course the fur trade, they went off in the fur trade again after the conquest under English bosses. The migration, then, so many French Canadians began to come over the border, especially in the 1840s and 50s when the railroads were being built. The Erie Canal, the railroads, these were a transportation breakthrough that began the industrialization and the economic revolution, really, in North America. And so a lot of people came over to work on the railways. Migration went on through the 19th century and into the 20th. We don't know how many French Canadians or French Americans, if you wish, served in the Union Army because of what happened to the names. The Union Army during the Civil War, recruiters, like local authorities when you came in, tended to write things down as they sounded. And many of the early immigrants were illiterate, so they didn't write their names down. And so the Yankee town clerk, when you said, je m'appelle Chatrin, oh yeah, Chatra, okay? It became Chatra. Trudeau sounded like T-R-E-D-O, that became Trudeau. Willette, the spelling changed from O-U-E-L-L-E-T-T-E to W-I-L-L-E-T-T. My barber in Old Town was Willette, the W. Thibault, T-E-B-O, instead of T-H-I-B-E-A-U-L-T, phonetically. La Fountain, or La Fontaine, or sometimes they translate it. was named Desjardins. The locals called him Gardner. LeBlanc might become white. La Roche would become Roque. Achelot, H-A-C-H-E-L-A-T, became Ashlaw. Ashlaw. That's what it sounded like to the Yankees. Paquette became Parker, J-Q-U-E-T-T-E. Champagne. Villeneuve got translated Newtown sometimes. And these children of New France thought of Quebec or Acadia as their old country. They had little interest in France. They resented France because they felt France had sold them out in 1759. In 1759, when the French and English were deciding what to do with the colonies, the war ground on until everybody went broke and got tired of it. And the French and English decided what to do with Canada. The French wanted to keep the sugar island of Guadeloupe. They were more interested in that than they were in Canada, and the Canadians knew it. And they did not care for that preference. The British said, okay, we'll take Canada. Voltaire, the philosopher, said, Canada is like Calcar Pond and Yesh, so many acres of snow. So the Canadians were not, especially after the French Revolution, when the revolution turned against the Catholic Church. You know, they began executing priests and nuns under the Jacobins. And so the Canadians regarded themselves as the daughter of the church rather than France, their country. And many French Americans today have become so completely acculturated, they have little or no interest even in Quebec or Acadia. Now Acadia, the Acadians live in largely New Brunswick, northern Maine, Nova Scotia, still some. They came back after the famed expulsion. They speak a little different French. I had a friend in graduate school, Roger Paradis, in Maine, who said he had a mixed marriage. He married a Quebecoise. Famous French Americans, of course, include Noah John Rondeau, the Hermit of the Adirondacks, and Edward Livingston Trudeau, the founder of the Saranac Lake Clinic for TB. This Trudeau, the ancestor of Doonesbury, the Trudeau that writes Doonesbury, creator, was not Canadian, but the other kind of French-American from New York, probably of Huguenot Protestant stock. He helped to found St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Saranac Lake, and St. John's in the Wilderness in Paul Smith's. The French, largely from Canada, came to the woods first, and then some of them settled in towns like Malone, Potsdam, Canton, Gouverneur, Watertown, and various villages in the Adirondacks. Often they clashed, not only with the Protestant Yankees who had preceded them. You know, the word Yankee is interesting, isn't it? In this context, it means a New Englander. If you're overseas, it means an American. If you're down south, it means a Northerner. And if you're in Massachusetts, it means somebody from Vermont, New Hampshire, or Maine. So, yeah. Anyway, New Englanders. But they also clashed with their fellow Roman Catholics, the Irish. The evidence of this persists in the dual Catholic churches in many northern towns, like Ogdensburg, which started with the Irish St. Mary's, that became the cathedral, and the French Notre Dame, where you probably can't find a French Mass anymore. Yeah. But that was the way it was. All the way from Old Town, Maine, across to Watertown, you found this duality among Catholics, the French and the Irish churches. Many towns and villages had their French sections, often near the railroad tracks, the least desirable living place in the age of steam locomotives because of the noise and the soot. Nowadays, we hear the train whistles, but pretty inoffensive and usually some distance away. The evidence of French presence in the North Country is certainly plain in the phone books. The wife of one of the hospice patients I visited in past years had a French birth name and a French face, clearly a daughter of New France, though she didn't speak French. And my climbing partner for years was a Labar from the Ellenberg area, who likewise didn't speak the language, though he took to the mountains like a guide of old. The Irish began coming to North America long before the famous famine of the 1840s. They came to northern New York through Montreal to farms around Bombay and what came to be called Irish Ridge, east of the Salmon River, to Adirondack villages like Minerva and Keysville. Driving the back roads of the North Country, I've seen several Irish settlement roads and Scotch settlement roads as well. Like the French, they tended to cling to their Catholic faith despite the preachments of Protestant circuit riders, and they did so at a cost, suffering from prejudice stirred up sometimes by Protestant ministers such as the Reverend Ashbel Parmalee of Malone, who was very anti-Catholic, vociferously anti-Catholic. The Irish influx became much larger after the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s. There were Protestant Irish as well, particularly in the southern Adirondacks, but not a lot of attention is paid to them by ethnicists because they tended to mix with the English, intermarry, as my parents did. So then they weren't considered real Irish, or not much was made of them, but they were there. They were there, like the Irish in the Scotch Irish, particularly in the Appalachian area. A group of Irish in Malone. Of course, the biggest influx was during the terrible potato famine of the 1840s, when millions either starved or left Ireland. And there are a lot of very sad songs about that. The Irish influx had already set in, however. A group of Irish in Malone in 1826 were meeting in a house for Sunday Mass, celebrated by a circuit-riding priest, Father John McNulty. They eventually incorporated as St. Joseph's Parish under Father Bernard McCabe. Malone had 300 French families by 1863, many no doubt working for the Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain Railroad, which had its maintenance shops and headquarters in Malone. The shop is still there, the buildings are still there, they're used for different things. Feeling less than welcome at St. Joseph's, they founded their own parish, Notre Dame, and the Bishop of Albany sent Father John Legrand to minister to them. Often some of the priests in the North Country, all the way across New England, had been educated at the Grand Seminaire in Quebec, which is still, has got to be the oldest Catholic seminary in North America, still operates near Laval University in Quebec City. Both groups, but especially Irish, settled in Covington and Bombay and Churubusco. That's a very interesting name, Churubusco. And I've tried vainly to research its origins because during the Mexican War, this is little known, but a group of Irish Americans in the American Army discovered they were fighting their fellow Catholics in Mexico, and they defected, joined the Mexican Army, forming the San Patricio Brigade. And when they were captured, they were shot as traitors at Churubusco, after the Battle of Churubusco. And so I'm wondering if there's a connection between Churubusco, New York, and Churubusco, Mexico. I think there must be. I wrote the priest, but he didn't know. And I should get over to Malone Historical Society, see if anybody over there
The tricky thing is it could be a French name that's been anglicized.
Really,
Maybe
it's
spelled
spelled
differently, you know.
Churubusco? Huh. Yeah, well, that's possible, that's possible. Well, the Catholic Vicar General of Montreal asked the Bishop of Albany to send in a priest for those families in Malone. Not all these families stayed in the area. Like many Yankees, many went west as pioneer farmers or workers in what would be called the Midwest. There were uprisings in both Canadas in 1837 and 1838 against the local elites, rebellions harshly suppressed by British troops and loyal militia, and a considerable number of refugees came south of the border, including for a time Louis-Joseph Papineau, the leader of the Quebec Rebellion, or Canada Uprising, and Edmund B. O'Callaghan, also one of the leaders in Lower Canada, who he stayed on, O'Callaghan, and became the New York State historian, organized and published 6 volumes of the New York archives, which has been of tremendous value to historians. Refugees from the potato famine came to Minerva and founded Irish Town there. Their first resident pastor in 1867 was Father Louis Desroches. How did that work out? Sister Mary Christine Taylor writes about the widening breach between the French of Chateauguay and the Irish of Churubusco and Ellenburg. Father Michael Charbonneau of Black Brook was opposed by his Irish parishioners because he could not speak good English, while Father J.J. Fitzgerald of nearby Sable Forks was resented by the French. Varric Chittenden remembers when Holy Cross Church in Hopkinton alternated between French and Irish pastors. There was Father O'Day, A-U-D-E-T, not O'Day. Father Murphy, Father Plant. Come to think of it, Father Gary Giroux, in the recent past in Potsdam, replaced Father John Kennahan. But since then, we've had 2 priests with French names, so my theory goes on. We now have Father O'Corn. Okay. An attraction for workers from Canada along the border in the 1840s and 50s was the Northern Railroad. Later, Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain. Still later than that, the Rutland. From Rouse's Point to Ogdensburg. It was opened in 1850. The Malone Frontier Palladium of September 26th announced, "We are bound to advance with rapid strides. Human efforts and earthly obstacles cannot restrain us, Excelsior." Well, imagine what it must have been like. All of a sudden, you could travel over to Plattsburgh and back in the day, you know, where it used to be a 3 or 4 day journey on the road. It was an age of optimism. Everything was getting better, progress and so on. The remnants of the structures of that railroad are still visible in Malone if you know where to look. And over in Winthrop you can see where the buildings are lined where the tracks came through. The railroad brought a special group of Irish to Malone in 1866, and again in 1870, the Fenians, who tried to invade Canada on behalf of their alienated and their colonized country. The Fenian Order were largely Union veterans who organized themselves as an army and made several attempts to invade Canada, in Brunswick, a couple in Ontario. Ultimately, the great-grandfather of an Irish-American friend of ours in Helena was Colonel Mannix, the commander of these would-be freedom fighters. He had been a captain in the Union Army, and most of his troops were veterans of that conflict. In both attempts, the Canadian militia drove them back. And the U.S. Army finally was sent to Malone under George Gordon Meade, the hero of Gettysburg, with 100 soldiers to send the boys in green back on the railway, disarm them. Railroads in the area in the 1800s would include the Rome, Watertown, and Ogdensburg, today's CSX Montreal line that comes through. The Delaware and Hudson up the shore of Lake Champlain, the Adirondack Railroad to North Creek from Saratoga Springs, still running. Branches from these lines fanned into the woods and facilitated lumbering. The railroads themselves lured workers to the region, many of the Irish and French. We have few stories in their words for the obvious reason that most were either illiterate or had little time to write their memoirs. They might tell stories, however, in the camp, and some of these stories got repeated. A few in songs as well. There were singers. A few people, especially in the 20th century, had the presence of mind to interview them, such as Warren Gwinnett, who got the story of Ugly Mike O'Mara, who he writes had an uncanny knack for laying out logging roads and wonderful skill as a camp cook and singer of ballads. Now, what wasn't much else to do at night in the bunkhouse? You sang or told stories. Perhaps he sang the one about moose turd pie. I'll share with you at the end of it. We also have accounts by visitors from the time to tell us about things like the camp of French workers building the Cranberry Lake Railroad from Vincent Mines to Wanakena, the headquarters of the rich lumber empire. In the St. Lawrence Valley, Bessie Capers writes, by 1865, most towns had Irish settlements. She found only 4 teachers out of the 226 she surveyed were Irish born, and only 10 were Irish, whether born there or in the United States. Quote, these new Irish Americans had yet to achieve middle-class status needed to gain entrance into the world of higher education, and their Catholicism bothered many of their Protestant neighbors. At the same time, many Irish Catholics objected to the use of the Protestant Bible and ethnic slurs in the textbooks. It was not a time of tolerance on either side. And it's interesting that New York was one of the first states to abolish prayer in the public schools. It wasn't because of secular humanists. It wasn't those Unitarian Universalists. It was Catholics that insisted on that. The Archbishop of New York said we're not going to have our children exposed to Protestant rituals in schools, so they said, okay, we will not have religious, the schools will be neutral to her. And it's been that way since. It was not so in Massachusetts when I was growing up. We did Christmas pageants and all. And before every assembly, the principal read us those sterner passages of the Bible about weeping and gnashing of teeth. But Irish teachers began to be assigned to mainly Irish districts. District lines were porous and came to be divided along religious lines for a while. The distinctions seem to have disappeared pretty much by the end of the 19th century. One interesting account is by a Protestant minister, the Reverend E.E. Grosh, hired by the Herd Lumber Company to serve Protestants in Santa Clara and other places in the area in the 1890s. He reached Santa Clara by train in July 1891 to be greeted by the Canadian Frenchman. He found a small Episcopal church there without as yet a priest, and he served his own congregation, seems to have been Presbyterian, before the arrival of their own clergy. Episcopalians and Catholics attended his general ecumenical service. Roman Catholic services were later held in a large hall for French workers. He said he found a sign outside the hall on the barber shop, haircut and shave, 25 cents and no grumbling. He visited the camps of the Everton Lumber Company, but found few Protestants there to serve. He described a camp of about 30 men, plenty of pork and beans, potatoes, bread, butter, and vinegar pie. Vinegar pie. The men seemed to enjoy their meal. They'd better, right? Wait till I tell you the story. He found French Canadians in some managerial positions on the railroad or lumber company, and some running businesses. Most were very poor, however, living in extremely tight quarters, unclean, lacking in knowledge of health matters. But he adds, many were bright and intelligent, needing but a chance to move forward. They were not, for Grosh, innately inferior, as some Yankees and Irish thought. Grosh employed a French-Canadian girl as a domestic, taught her English, reading and writing. He found her French quite different from that of France. He decided it must be an older French, like the English of Appalachia, and he found much of the workman's language a patois of French, English, and Indian. Patois is what we used to call Louistonese in Maine. It's found on both sides of the border. I'll give you an example. I was taking a passenger train that no longer exists between Maine and Montreal, and we stopped in the eastern townships, I can't remember where, just east of Montreal, and this woman got aboard and she was saying goodbye to her family, and it went like this: au revoir, écris en lettres, you know, break your arm. And a lot of the patois was like that. English words worked their way in. The village of Brandon had over 700 people, mostly French. Some were interested in becoming citizens. Others planned to go home to Quebec. All the immigrant groups, most of them came thinking they were going to make money and go home. They didn't intend to stay, but they did, ultimately. Both groups contributed to the folk song tradition of the region, but especially the Irish, according to Robert Davis Bethke. The Irish often worked on the railroads while the French predominated in logging. Irish names can be found on the payrolls of companies like the Grass River Railroad, the Mohawk and Malone, and American Graphite on file at the Adirondack Museum. That's, by the way, a wonderful source of information, as well as the best laid out museum I've ever seen. The French Canadians were logging near the mouths of the Raquette and Oswegatchie rivers before they got into the Adirondacks. Timber which would be made into huge rafts and floated down to Quebec City for shipment to Britain and Europe. They were among the best men at river driving, a hazardous occupation. Men, they walked on top of those logs. Their contribution to the folk tradition seems more often to have been in English by men like Eddie Ashlaw, who worked at the St. Regis Paper Company lands in the 1900s. Two of his were Wild Mustard River, I'm Just a Common Lumberjack, and The Roving Ashlaw Man. The attachment to land was strong even among the loggers, whose wives and children frequently farmed in a small way at home. Often, you know, during the planting season, they'd be at home. It was only in the off-season for farming they came and logged, got into the lumber in the woods. And the winter was especially good time because it was easier to get the logs out. They could slide them. William Marlowe writes in Big Moose Station the story of folks drawn to that tiny hamlet by the building of William Stewart Webb's Mohawk and Malone Railroad, completed from Utica to Montreal by 1892. The majority of the village were either French, like Marlowe's family, or Irish. He tells of Dennis Hennessy, whose family crossed the Atlantic during the Great Famine of the 1840s and settled in Ontario. They brought, he says, strength and brawn, a willingness to work to escape the hated rule of the English. Their intense love of Erin, their beautiful songs, and their sense of humor. However, he goes on, their predisposition to drink in some cases led to most belligerent actions. According to Marlowe's aunt, a quarter Irish herself, The border was completely porous, unlike today, crossed easily. Labor flowed freely over it. Dennis Hennessy and others, hearing about the building of Webb's Line, came down to find work. He became a section gang foreman. The Irish had one advantage over the French and the Italians: they spoke English. Dennis arrived in Big Moose Station in 1893 with 6 children, 4 of them boys, all of whom later worked for the railroad. In 1895, he became the local postmaster, and the following year built a hotel. Sportsmen were already coming in by train. Hennessy was known as a hard drinker, but a peaceful, kindly man, not a troublemaker. His brother-in-law, Mike Bogan, like Dennis, was a canaler turned railway man and came with him. There were also Hennessy cousins named Halvin and Corcoran, all neighbors back in Ontario, and all with the railroad. Dennis died at the age of 60 in 1908, and his wife continued to run the Summit Hotel. These were rough men, drinkers, fighters. The fights were legendary, Marlowe says. It was incredible the amount of furniture, dishes, etc. that were thrown out of the doors and windows in these fights. After terrible fights the next day, they were friends again. Many of these Irish were gone by 1910. Hennessy's widow Jane ran the hotel till 1919. When she sold it, it burned in 1939. Is there a community there, or did it die with the Adirondack Division? I don't know. The Adirondack Division is still there, but it only runs trains twice a year up to Lake Placid to be scenic, the scenic railroad. And there is a group that wants to build a trail out of it. A little editorial there. The French at Big Moose Station included Moreau's, Paramount, Rozan's. Joseph Paramount was a blacksmith for the Big Moose Lumber Company. We had a Rozan in our parish in Potsdam, and he told me he went to Quebec once and he saw a roadside stand called Rozan Farms, and he stopped and he said, we looked at each other and we couldn't talk to each other. I couldn't speak French, he couldn't speak English. We were a mirror image of each other. Pierre Rozan. Joseph Paramount was a blacksmith for the Big Moose Lumber Company. Marlowe's uncle Ovita came in 1908 from a farm in Quebec and bought a house in 19. He spoke no English. He and his wife, Alice Chenier, raised their family in Big Moose Station. Another son of Quebec, George LaFountain, ran the first steamboat on Tupper Lake for John Hurd, the lumber magnate. The steamboats were extensions of the railroads. Of course, the Helen at Cranberry Lake Village carried mail to all the camps around. He later ran the Big Moose Transportation Company, trucks, buses between the station and the lake, and boats on the lake. So some of these people became entrepreneurs. Besides lumbering and railroading, some of the French became guides. An unpublished manuscript by Philip C. Capone in the Saranac Lake Free Library tells the story of the DeBards, a family of guides in the eastern Adirondacks. John was a voyager and trapper who came over in 1817 and settled on the shores of a picturesque pond in what was later called Duane. Duane is, you just see it as a town line sign going down 30, but it's still there. Both the pond and the mountain, DeBar Mountain, which overshadows it, had been given the family name. He had 3 sons, but he must have married an Anglo because the sons were named Lyman, William, and John. William and John were Union soldiers in the Civil War. Lyman took up the guiding trade in the Meacham Lake Hotel. Yeah, guides hung out at the hotels when sportsmen came in. They wanted to go out and shoot deer or fish, but they didn't want to have to build fires and find the good places, so they always hired a guide to do that. a sportsman check in and wait until the proper guide showed up, or the guide would be waiting for him. Lyman DeVar was remembered for long black hair, which he let grow for a couple of years. His son George also guided out of Meacham Lake Hotel, and few parties guided over ever came back empty-handed. Died in the 1940s. His son Elda served in World War II and worked for the Conservation Department Forest Headquarters in Dickinson in 1962. 20th century figures include the redoubtable Hermit of Coal River, the mayor of Coal River. He called himself Noah John Rondeau, product of a devoutly Catholic French family near Sable Forks. He ran away from family and church early in life, and then from civilization itself. He wrote a journal about his earlier life. He wrote of his father, Peter, and his grandfather, Charles Corot, who had come from Canada and served in the Union Army. He used to parade about Sable Forks in his blue uniform, Rondeau wrote, and march in Memorial Day parades. Rondeau tells of his family Christmas, which consisted only of going to Mass. It was New Year's that got the celebration, complete with the little God who came down the stovepipe bearing presents for children that filled stockings hung on wooden pegs. Rondeau's father beat him, and he ran away. He managed to learn English and finish 5th grade. In 1913, he was guiding out of Axton's Landing, where he knew Clarence Petty and his father, as told by Chris Angus in his excellent book, The Extraordinary Adirondack Journey of Clarence Petty. Maitland de Sormo, himself of French ancestry. The name looks Italian, doesn't it? D-E-S-O-M-R-M-O. But it came from D-E-S, capital O-R-M-E-A-U-X, des Ormeaux. Maybe descended, he wouldn't be descended from, but the des Ormeaux who saved Quebec in the 1640s from Iroquois attack, or that's another story. I mustn't teach Canadian history. Focus. Maitland de Sormo. Understandably, such a way of life had an attraction for him that it had for countless of French Canadians, and made him, like them, eager to enjoy the excitement, freedom, and adventure offered by constant contention with the wilderness environment. These Quebecois refugees from farm and factory are the spiritual descendants of the coureurs de bois, who left the Laurentian villages in the 17th and 18th centuries to be trappers and fur traders in Western Canada. The first great novel about French Quebec was written by a Frenchman from France, Louis Aymon, Maria Chapdelaine. Written in 1914 by this Frenchman who came to live in Quebec for a time in the Lake St. John area way north of Quebec. This area was promoted in the late 1800s by the Catholic hierarchy as a good place for young Quebecers to go settle rather than go to the States, where they might lose their faith and their language. Well, it's interesting. They probably haven't lost their faith. They lost the language. But now, a very small percent go to church in Quebec province, but many more French Canadians in the U.S. do, I'm sure. Interesting irony. The two groups, wait a minute. Okay, Maria's father dies. They try to farm up in that hostile Lake St. John area, if you've ever been there, harsh climate. And she had to choose between two suitors in the novel. One who wanted to take her to the bright lights of Worcester, Massachusetts, and another who would stay in the northern homeland. I won't tell you her choice, you've got to read it. Worcester, Mass. has two immense Catholic churches close in to each other. One French, one Irish. Notre Dame des Canadiens and St. Mary's, or St. Patrick's, I think. The two groups are no longer much divided by language or culture there. but remnants of that division remain from Old Town to Oswego, Worcester to Hartford, and other northeastern cities. The names, and in some cases the churches, are still visible in the Adirondacks and in the North Country. French families often spoke French at home after learning English to fit in with the new environment. And sometimes they used it as the language when they didn't want their children to understand their maison form. This faded fairly soon after World War II. Our teachers, I lived in an area with a lot of Italian kids, and our teachers used to tell the Italian Americans, don't let your family, make them teach you Italian too. Don't let them use that as a secret language. Have two languages. And most of the teachers were Irish, so it's to their credit. After World War II, with returning veterans, growing tendency to intermarriage with other Catholics and even with English Protestants, part of this was due to the schools where English had to be used. In northern Maine, in some areas I think still, French can be used until second grade, then instruction has to be English. Children learn to function in English. Sometimes parents, again, use the French as the secret language. Of course, there was pervasive influence of radio and television, too, breaking down the differences. English more and more became the language of the churches, and French got used only on monuments. This is reminiscent of the experience of the Dutch in southern New York and the early national period, or the French Huguenots of Charleston, South Carolina, visiting there. We visited a French Protestant church, and I asked the lady, do you still have services in French? She said, only the opening hymn. Yet there are traces of folk cultures even into the 21st century. What remains? I see the occasional wayside cross or shrine. There's the occasional French-style farmhouse built like an habitant cottage. As a boy in Massachusetts, I remember going to my brother's friends, the Thiebaud's, after our respective midnight services, and eating meat pie or tortilla and partying all night. Coming home somewhat bleary-eyed to watch my kid brother open his presents. Peter Van Lent reminds us of the French love of color and ornate decoration, how their red and blue roofs contrast with those of the dour New England English. There's a shade of the Anglos in Maine called Hail Mary Blue. Their ornate carved altarpieces contrast sharply not only with the more austere Protestant altars, but with the post-Vatican II Roman Catholic clean walls and bare tables. He also mentions the love of such crafts as carving, needlework, song, and painting among the French. I think of my friend in Norfolk who was always crocheting. Now, what is left of Irish distinctiveness? Even less, since they were English speakers from the start. St. Patrick's Day, yes, though overblown and often Americanized as an excuse in many cases for getting drunk. At least that's my excuse, my experience as a college professor. For the Catholic Irish, there is still a strong bond with that church, although we tend to forget there were also Irish Protestants, again, because they blended intermarried with English and Scots. Intermarriage and acculturation have done their work over the years, and the prejudices which divided Irish and French, and both from the English, have softened to a memory. If the identities remain at all, it is because they are consciously preserved by people who know that history is not just the past, it's a part of who we are. It lives in our attitudes, in our small customs, it lives in our hearts and minds, and in our very bones. And I'm going to tell you the story of Moose Turd Pie, which some of you have no doubt heard. It's even been put to song. In the legendary lumber camp, it was the custom that if anyone complained about the food, he got to be cooked. Which job nobody wanted. You had to get up before anyone. Get the stove going and so on, fixing breakfast. A novice who didn't know the drill complained one day and was made cook. He hated it, and yet no matter how badly he cooked, nobody would complain. So one day he went for a walk in the woods and he found a large moose dropping. I said to himself, well, I'll make a moose turd pie. That ought to do it. So he did. And he passed out the dessert. He watched anxiously as the first man took a forkful. That man gagged horribly and exclaimed, "Mon Dieu, c'est le moose turd pie." Thought for a moment and added, "Good though." Questions? Answer? Yeah.
One time the Irish language Gaelic was forbidden in Ireland, and of course back in the 1800s.
Yep.
Apparently none of that came over here.
No, very little. The Scots brought their version of Gaelic. In fact, they claim there's more Gaelic spoken in Cape Breton Island than there is in Scotland.
Yeah.
I don't know. But yeah, that's true.
Huh.
There's a lovely Tommy Macon song about that, about God bless England that began.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And no, there's another one, about the policeman who arrested a man for the language of his sign. But he was Jewish, it was Hebrew. At that time, the mayor of Dublin was a Jew.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And, what's it called? He said, I'm a Jew, sir, that came over to stay, and my name it is Moses Raiturle, and the judge says, you're a cousin of Briscoe's, and I am one too. This numbskull is blundered, and for it must pay. Something, the chorus, and then the last chorus is, there's a garbage collector on our little street, who once was a policeman, the pride of his beat. And he moans all the night, and he groans all the day, singing Moses right to a But no, I don't, as far as I know, Irish Gaelic wasn't brought over in any great amount. Maybe in Canada. Yep.
You referred to Edmund O'Callaghan. Edmund O'Callaghan, did you say? He wrote something? Edmund O'Callaghan?
Edmund O'Callaghan. Yeah, Edmund B. O'Callaghan was one of the rebel leaders in Lower Canada, along with Louis-Joseph Papineau. And they came down to the States. Papineau went back, ultimately was amnestied and became a member of Parliament again, but the Canadians are so forgiving. But O'Callaghan did not, and he became a historian and edited those 6 volumes of New York State Archives. Wonderful source for historians. That in the 1840s.
Is it the documentary history of New York? Was that the?
I don't think he called it that, but I'm not sure. He might have. I can't remember. I've used it, but I don't remember the exact title. Yeah, sure. We owe a lot to Edmund O'Callaghan. He did not go back.
Do you know if there were any records of the Peter Robinson settlers that came over from Ireland that came into the United States?
I don't know of that. No. There were some French speakers with Irish names or English names. Well, a premier of Quebec in the 1970s was Daniel Johnson. There were Irish or English soldiers took their discharge in Canada, married French girls, and down the generations, the English might have been lost, the name carried on. So there are O'Reillys, O'Malleys, and so on. Yeah.
When I first moved here, I was told a story that the butterflies that sometimes adorn the outsides of houses stem from the time after the revolutions of 1837, 38, when French Canadians were coming down from Canada to escape retribution after rebellion. And that French Canadians who were already here pinned butterflies to the sides of their houses as an indication that you could stop their and be taken.
That's very plausible, I just never.
I almost hate to ask you because I'm afraid you'll tell me that it's not true.
I just never heard it.
Never heard that?
No, that's good. I think it's very possible.
And I think it is unique to the North Country that you see people still today who have wooden or ornamental butterflies on their houses.
There was a lot of sympathy in the US with those uprisings. Americans thought of it as an extension of the American Revolution, which it wasn't. It wasn't basically against England. It was against the local elites. But there was a lot of sympathy, and some Americans went over and got involved, raided, you know, the Battle of the Windmill across the river from Ogdensburg in 1837-8. And the government of President Van Buren was very worried. He did not want the United States to aggravate the British and go to war. We weren't anyway ready for that. And so he sent troops to Ogdensburg to enforce neutrality, to keep people from going over raiding.
Well, wasn't the purpose of some of those raids to try to get, including on Canadians too? It seems like for quite a while, there was a good history of America trying to get Canada to break from England too.
Sure.
So they were supporting any at all kind of rebellion that
Well,
any
yeah.
Canadians might have had.
And Americans had a great lot of sympathy with that. The Fenians in New Maine that landed in eastern Maine, they're from all over, but they wanted to invade New Brunswick and rename it the province of Emmet for Robert Emmet, the Irish patriot. Yeah. An ancestor of mine supposedly was engaged to Robert Emmet, but the British hanged him first. Sarah Curran was her name. So I'm an honorary Fenian.
Yes.
Sir, did I hear you mention the Black Irish, or was that a misstatement from?
No, I didn't mention
From the
Black Irish.
appellation?
Black Irish.
You never heard that
I've heard the
Yes.
expression.
Yeah.
Well,
I've
what-
heard the expression that meaning and the interpretation that Irish who had dark hair were descended from the Spanish
The Moors?
Armada,
Southern
west
part.
ashore.
Well,
Yes.
sir,
In the
that
southern
was-
part
that
of
was-
Ireland,
Yes.
where the Roman Empire expanded and the Spanish came in. If you go to Ireland, those people are short and very dark.
Yeah.
The people on the west coast were Vikings and they're
Yeah, that's much more likely than the
still
Spanish
serious.
This
Armada.
stands to reason, because when I asked, my father had died, but I asked my mother about her people, her maiden name was Kennedy,
Yeah,
but she had French too in there. But, so then I asked her about Dad's people, and of course, first off, she said, they all came on the Mayflower, which